Welcome back to From the Pages. I'm JD, and today we're going to take a look at Amazing Spider-Man 2. Is there a good kind of Spidey sense tingle? I won't lie, folks, out of all the comic book films coming out this summer, this is the one I was least excited for. Not because I hated the first one, I actually defended it, but because the first one was pretty widely divided amongst those who enjoyed it and those who didn't. I'll be the first to admit that that film had flaws, but I'll also be the first to admit that the Raimi films were flawed too. Yeah, the right forms the left, whatever. Yeah, I'm sorry, but while the Raimi films did many things right, but they got a lot wrong as well. I'll probably go into it at some point, but yeah, the Goblin's costume never worked for me, the lack of equipping Spider-Man never sat right, and save for the right out of the comics kiss scene, I never really bought into the Peter and MJ romance. That said, the first Amazing film also had its share of problems as well. The first one being the villain. The Lizard's motivation was unclear, and I wasn't sure if it was coming from Dr. Connors or the Lizard as a split personality. The other big problem was that it was just so painfully aware that it was in the shadow of the Raimi films that every decision they made was clearly to draw a line in the sand saying, "Nope, we're doing our own thing here, can't compare us to those movies." And they did it so much that you can't help but compare it to the Raimi films. By drawing a line in the sand, they just ended up putting their head in it. A different costume, a new villain, a new love interest with Gwen Stacy, Uncle Ben dancing around saying, "With great power comes great responsibility." All of this really just was a way of avoiding comparison to the Raimi's films. But while the Lizard still kind of sucked, I was willing to forgive the distancing itself from the Raimi film because what else were they gonna do? It hadn't been that long for the series to reboot, and I can't blame the film creators because the studio wanted to push to keep the film rights. And it was entirely possible, now that they have decided their own voice, that they could stride with more confidence into The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Well, that was a theory anyways. Let me begin by saying I like most of this film. I know that sounds weird since it seems like I'm about to tear into this. I will say outside of maybe a few dodgy CGI sequences and a couple comedy bits that fall flat, the majority of the scenes do in fact work. The problem is that it fails to come together as a whole. The individual elements are strong, fantastic action choreography, and some genuinely funny one-liners, good performances, and a hero that takes time to save people, and an end scene that will likely shock fans not familiar with the comics. Heck, even for me it caused me to choke up a bit, but when you try to look at it as a singular film and what story it was trying to tell, it kind of falls apart. The story bits are all a bit of a mess with too many moving pieces. Peter and Gwen's romance keeps stalling out, initially because Peter feels guilty of the death of Gwen's father in the previous film, but the movie seems to forget that for the middle section and instead focuses on Gwen possibly moving away to England as a romantic roadblock. Jamie Foxx is introduced as Max Dillon, aka the villain Electro, and actually, even though he's gotten a lot of criticism, I actually thought this worked. Mostly. How Electro goes from a nerdy nobody to a slightly creepy obsessive to a misunderstood monster to arch supervillain is handled mostly well. He's a bit OTT, but compared to other villains in the series, I think Fox handles himself about as well as can be expected. It's just that his entire plot is not really vital to the main story. Less fluid than Electro is Harry Osborn, who, yeah, okay, mostly this doesn't work for me. Harry comes back into town just as his father, Norman Osborn, is dying. Norman, by the way, is played by Chris Cooper, so insert gratuitous Muppets clip here.
Maniacal laugh. Maniacal laugh. Maniacal laugh. Maniacal laugh.
Anyway, Harry's inherited the same disease and becomes obsessed with finding a cure, even though it took 40 years to kill his father. Harry becomes convinced that the cure is Spider-Man's blood, and much of the middle of the film is him becoming increasingly desperate and obsessed with getting cured, leading him to eventually putting on a familiar green suit and glider. Oh god, I take it back. Give me back the silly Power Rangers mask from the first Raimi film. Harry ultimately doesn't work because he was never established properly. Even though the Raimi's Spider-Man 3 had a lot of problems, it did spend 2 films giving Harry further motivation to turn down a dark path. But here, He's mostly just a guy who hasn't seen Peter in 10 years, and they skip a few rocks together, and now we're supposed to care about his sudden but inevitable betrayal. It just doesn't work. And I'm not going to spoil the ending, but while it does pull on the emotional strings, it only did so briefly for me. While the ending was foreshadowed heavily enough, I'm not sure it was necessarily set up well. It wants the payoff of those tugged heartstrings, but doesn't do the legwork to really earn it. Also, there's a lot of other stuff going on here, teasing future movies. Yeah, all those scenes of the Rhino they've been teasing in the trailers, that's presumably for the next movie. As are the cameos of a handful of other characters that seem there just so that way the nerd crowd can get excited for potential sequels. Oh, and there's a mostly pointless subplot about Peter's dad that seemed to be wrapping up unexplained parts of the first film, but really doesn't tie into the main plot and probably should have just been cut. Though it does give Peter and Aunt May a really good scene together. And the most frustrating thing is, despite all these complaints, I can't say this is a bad film. I'd say it's about on par with Iron Man 2, another film that I thought was okay, but got bogged down by focusing less on telling a single good story, and instead allowed itself to get distracted by setting up future Avenger films. But Iron Man 2 had the benefit of the goodwill of the first Iron Man film. Most of the problems here are the same problems that were present in The Amazing Spider-Man. The villain isn't that great, the story doesn't quite come together right. It's just that this is a little bit more pronounced. The individual elements are stronger, but as a whole, it just doesn't come together. I can't even say I hate it, I can't say that I love it. I'm just not as excited to see them tease out more films and spin-offs when they haven't really managed to tell a great Spider-Man film yet. At least that's how it was for me. I will fully admit that when I saw this in a theater, my audience applauded. And we don't do that here in the Midwest, at least not in my corner. So I urge you to find out for yourself. Go see it, and let me know what you think in a comment below. And until next time, I'll see you guys in less than a month for X-Men: Days of Future Past.